And thank you very much. So, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone, depending when your actual location is. Welcome to this session on session number 124, one of the last this conference devoted to TSO and DSO topics. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm really delighted to chair this session, to be given this opportunity, especially on the concerned matters. Just a few words for introducing myself. So I am Jean-Yves Bourmaud, currently working from RT. I have started to work on the research field regarding power system when I was at EDF. Since 2003, I have been a senior expert in cross-border management and market mechanism for RTE in its research department here in La Défense. I have been involved in the Central Western Europe market coupling initiative, and especially the flow-based part. I am now involved in prospective studies on the full energy system, and with a focus on flexibility, and in particular in the context of the H2020 Osmos project. So I would like to thank all our speakers for participating in this great event. As already reminded to you by Pierre, each speaker today will have 20 minutes of presentation, followed by 5 to 10 minutes of question and answers. I will try to moderate this discussion as best as I can. And I will try to keep the time as well. As I'm really happy to be there, I don't want to take you more time. So I will give the floor to Athir Nouicer. I hope I am pronouncing your name the right way. Thank you very much for joining this session. And if it's okay on your side, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean-Yves, and thank you, Pierre, for organizing this. Yeah, you pronounced my name right, and that's not very often the case. So let me share my screen, and should be seeing the presentation now. Okay, so my name is Athir Nouicer, and I'm a research associate at the Florence School of Regulation at the European University Institute, and I'm also a PhD researcher at KU Leuven. And today I'm glad to present you my the first part of my PhD on the economics of explicit demand-side flexibility in distribution grid, which was developed in the framework of the first working paper that is now submitted to the Energy Journal, and that passed the first round of review. And it was done together with Leonardo, Meeus from Erik School and FSR, and also from Erik Delarue, which is my supervisor at KU Leuven. So how the outline of the presentation would be the traditional ones, starting from the relevance of the work, the modeling, then numerical example and result, and finally we end by a conclusion. So how this started, or how the idea from here of this research project started? It started from our initial focus on the clean energy package, you see the provision allowing DSO to procure flexibility, such as here the Article 32 of the Electricity Directive, which says that distribution network development plan shall include the use of demand response and other alternative to system expansion, traditional one that is investing in wires. And also the Article 13 of the Electricity Regulation that says, for instance, that TSOs and DSO are not prevented, or in other terms, are allowed to take into account up to 5% of annual redispatch from renewables and or high energy efficiency cogeneration. That should be, of course, minimalized and assessed in a cost-benefit way. And after following the clean energy package, there had been different studies focusing on the different flexibility tools, such as the TSO DSO report that you could see on the right side of the slide, that was developed by the DSO Association in Europe and SOE, that kind of drew or published this toolbox for active system management. That's the way that's called. That includes technical solution, tariff solution that is referred to as implicit demand-side flexibility, market-based solution for flexibility, connection agreement or smart contract that are also referred to as this, and finally rules-based approach. And also there have been many studies developed on this context that we also took into account when we were trying to find the relevant research question to answer. And you could see here many studies, such as the one from Enedis that assessed the different cost and benefit of 6 flexibility options on demand side and supply side as alternative to network expansion, and that found that they may provide significant net gains by 2030. There is also this a study by the BMWE, that the one on the up left, that was developed, I think, 2015 to the German Energy Ministry, that found like that allowing DSO to curtail up to 3% of distributed generation, which you could see in the graph here, could allow up to 40% saving in network expansion cost. And also there was this impact assessment for the European Commission that was developed by Copenhagen Economics and VVA Europe that estimated that up to 5 billion annual saving could be done at the EU level by avoiding unnecessary investment towards 2030, both from the demand, both using demand side and supply side the flexibility. Then following this, there was last year this report by SEER that investigated a bit more in depth the regulatory condition for the procurement of flexibility. And here it says that sometimes market-based flexibility could not function well if the preconditions are not satisfied. And then it may be necessary to assess or to introduce administrative measure, meaning that the price of the flexibility would be set administratively. And also it highlights that it's even when you go for an administratively set flexibility price, it may not be trivial to for grid provider to set the exact price. And this is one of the contribution of this work, is that to assess or to investigate which level of compensation for flexibility could be decided by distribution system operator or by the regulator, depending on the context. And when we move it into the academia, we identify two different streams regarding demand side flexibility. The first one on the left, that is the state of the art on implicit demand side flexibility, meaning networks tariff design. We analyzed the papers that I list there, and most of them they focus on fairness, cost reflectivity issue, which tariff design or which network tariff design could be the best with the increasing integration of prosumer or of distributed generation. And then on the right-hand side, there is the state of the art on explicit demand side flexibility, where there have been different bi-level models or other type of models for assessing the contribution of including the demand response or flexibility from the demand side at when planning the network. However, we found that these two streams that have not been combined in one research paper. So one other contribution of our work is to assess how network tariff, that is implicit demand side flexibility, and other form of explicit demand side flexibility, that is curtailment of demand through a fixed compensation, could interact. This being said, in order to assess these two contribution, we also did a modeling contribution that is developing this bi-level model where we have in the upper level a regulated TSO that tries to maximize the system welfare. And he has the following decision variable: the structure of the network tariff and the component or the magnitude of this of the tariff component, and also the flexibility procurement, that is the quantity he will procure for a fixed price. And of course, he has the constraint of collecting the grid cost investment and the flexibility cost through the network charges. In the lower level, we have the lower the self-interest pursuing consumer, we call, and they could be active or passive. Active meaning they could invest in PV and batteries, and passive meaning they could not invest and in those DERs. And both consumers have to fulfill their individual electricity demand. And this week, so to dig deeper on the underlying equation, we see here how do we model the social welfare being the gross system welfare and minus the total system cost. And this total system cost are the grid cost, the flexibility cost, the DER cost, investment cost, and also the system energy cost. And you see the equation 7, that is the constraint aiming at collecting grid cost and system flex cost through network charges. And the consumer problem is quite similar in the form. However, each consumer try to optimize it individually, and they have to fulfill their own demand. And you could see here that from their how we model their gross consumer surplus, that is the original demand minus the flexibility procured, that is the foregone demand multiplied by vol, to which we add the welfare correction, that is the income that they would receive from giving out a part of their consumption against and receiving at the same time the compensation for this flexibility. So we chose the following numerical example and reference scenario. We chose a vol equal to 5.33 euro. That is equal to the value of lack of adequacy in Belgium. That is the original vol at 10, which is 10 euro, but with a notice factor about the curtailment event that has to happen in the previous 24 hours. We chose a compensation equal to 1 euro, an annual demand of 400 kilowatt hour, and we included 15 critical days a year. And you could see the profile of the critical days on the right-hand side. Those are in red, while the normal days are the ones that are in blue, in dashed blue, and they happen 350 times a year. And yeah, you could see the other parameter we included in the reference scenario. We also went for a capacity-based network tariff. And at the first result we got here, we wanted to check how flexibility helps grid cost saving, meaning only the investment in grids. So we included in steps the different flexibility level. And here, please note that the x-axis is not linear. And we saw that this graph resembles the graph I showed in the introduction. And you could see that 2%, for instance, demand side flexibility could realize maybe 40+% saving in network costs. However, it could go to 100%, but this is not logical to arrive to that. So we wanted to see the impact on total system cost. And here the curve has a different shape, because at higher demand side flexibility level, you have to include the costs of this flexibility, which could go negative if there is a higher curtailment. So the question is where to stop. So for this, we try to pick the different welfare or system welfare level, that is the gross system welfare minus the total system cost, and we in steps also. And you could see here the shape that the maximum would be between 1% and 3%, and then we let the model decide on the optimal level itself, and we reached an optimal level of 1.48% of demand side flexibility that would lead to a 23,000 euro system welfare. And how the profile of the consumer look like at this optimal point, we see here on the left-hand side the profiles of the prosumers, and on the right-hand side the profile of the passive consumer. We could see the in purple, I think this the role of the battery, or in pink. I'm not good with the colors, and that is that are used for the day peak, while for the evening peak, while there is a solar output used to cover the demand during the day peak. However, as passive consumer, they don't have this, the battery nor PV, they get curtailed more. And the reasoning here, or what is happening behind, is that the prosumers, they receive signals first through network tariff to use their battery when it's needed, meaning at the evening peak, and also their PV output during the day peak, therefore contributing to reducing their demand peak. And accordingly, the passive consumer will get curtailed towards more higher level than prosumers, to realize this optimal system welfare. And to grasp more what is happening behind, and how the capacity-based network tariff reacts with the demand side, the explicit demand side flexibility, we included here the different system welfare, first with volumetric tariff, then with capacity-based tariff without flexibility, and then with capacity-based tariff with flexibility. So we see that in this context, with prosumers, capacity-based tariff lead to higher welfare, and this confirms the state of the art of the papers that we have analyzed. And then the further contribution is adding this explicit form of demand-side flexibility that increases the system welfare by 500 euro against 70 euro payment per year per consumer. And yeah, so, and then after that, we wanted to check what is the impact if we have imperfect network tariff. And we included here a weighting factor of 0.5, meaning that when a 1 kilowatt reduction in the consumer profile would peak would contribute only to 0.5 reduction in the system peak. And we see here that still there is the use of battery at the night peak, but overall it's less used, and the demand, the consumer baseline or the consumer profile is higher, meaning it's less reduced than with more perfect network tariffs. And accordingly, as this benchmark of prosumers is less system friendly, if I may say, the passive consumer are curtailed less. And here, in fact, also we cannot use too much the curtailment, because it will lead to an increase in system tariff overall, and that the curtailment would not, it's complementary to network tariff, but if network tariff are too imperfect, the curtailment could help a bit, but to a certain limit. And then after that, we wanted to try to assess the impact of different compensation levels. So we tried two other cases compared to the reference scenario where the compensation is 1. So for a compensation that is 0.5 euro, it led to lower flexibility level and lower welfare gain. And here, because the compensation is too low to compensate the passive consumer and the prosumers for the foregone electricity, so it results in a lower welfare gain. However, when we went to 5.3, which is the value of the lost load that we may think that is the most optimal scenario, we found that the flexibility level is almost similar. However, the welfare gain is lower. And we wanted to investigate why. So we checked how does the load profile look like, and we here, as in the previous slide, we put the prosumer on the left and the passive consumers on the right. And we saw that the reaction or the behavior of the prosumer is different. Indeed, they don't fully help the system, the system operation and the system investment. So they inject the electricity from their battery at not 100% needed times. So they create a different peak for the system, or at least they don't help it as in the case of lower compensation. And the reason here is that prosumer gain this case because they are at 5.3 euro compensation. It may be this compensation is too high for them because they could rely on their own consumption or from PV and also from their battery. And in this way, they would kind of behave strategically in order to benefit from this high compensation and to realize more individual welfare for them. And
Athir, you have 2 to 3 minutes left.
Okay, this is the slide before the last one. So yeah, finally in the paper, we did some sensitivity analysis. We wanted to check the different level of vol, the frequency of critical days, and what the impact of different network expansion costs. For the first table here, you could see the impact of having different vols. So a very high vol would lead to lower flexibility levels when it's taken into account at the distribution, at the planning stage, and also lower welfare gain. And moving from the last column to the middle one, that is the reference scenario, is taking into account 1 day notice of the curtailment event. So this means that in case of DSO having or planning this, just informing the consumer 24 hours before about the curtailment event could make them or could make the curtailment event more acceptable. And in the second table, we did different analysis for according to the frequency of the critical days. In the reference scenario, it's 15 days, but when we try to make more frequent critical days, meaning 104 per year, that corresponds to the weekend, the number of weekend days per year, we saw that there is no flexibility procured or no demand curtailed, meaning that if they become too frequent, it's better for the DSO to invest in the network as it won't lead to any welfare gain. And finally, we assessed that the impact of different network expansion costs, where you could see for a lower network expansion cost, there would be lower flexibility level, and for higher expansion costs, the flexibility level will increase. And to conclude, in this work, we moved away from simple cost analysis to include the benefit of demand-side flexibility and to show the trade-off between the investment and the demand-side flex. We also assessed the interaction between implicit demand-side flexibility, being network tariff, and flexibility and explicit incentives, and how imperfect network tariff could be slightly corrected by the explicit one, but to certain limit. Then we also, on the appropriate level of compensation, we have seen that it's not that evident to assess it, to decide on it. However, it will be lower than vol because prosumer or could value less the flexibility if they could value less electricity consumption if they could rely on other sources for electrifying or for consuming. And we also found that in country with lower vol, there is higher potential for explicit demand-side flexibility. And finally, as I said in the sensitivity analysis, we found out that depending on the number of critical days, there could be more or less potential for explicit demand-side flexibility. And with this, I finish it. Thank you to you, Jean-Yves. I stop sharing, if I may, or.
Maybe the question is.
As you wish, you can keep it for the Q&A.
Okay.
Okay.
Then Thank you very much, Athir, for this very interesting presentation and this topic, the concept you explain here about how explicit demand side could be quite beneficial to the distribution grid and this balance the operator will have to make between implicit and explicit demand side flexibility. I will now open the questions to the attendees. Please raise your hand if you have questions. So I see that Michiel has a question. Maybe you can.
Yeah. Hi, Athir. Thanks for the nice presentation. I have maybe a short question. So if I correctly, you attach some price elasticity towards consumers. And I'm wondering, like to model the flexibility, and I'm wondering whether when you project your findings towards the future, when there are more, or when there's more electrification of appliances, how that scales your results. Do your investments of consumers scale with the absolute demand that they have? Or would you expect other results when your absolute demand, when your demand curve shifts instead of adds more elasticity, if you got what I mean?
I mean, this would resemble to the case where we have more prosumer, more or less, because they are the one that would have more flexible devices somehow. And in this case, I would see that if there is more flexible demand or more potential for flexible demand, then in theory, this flexible demand should be used by the system through, or profited by the system through network tariff. If they are well designed, then and we have enough prosumers in the network, then they will be reached through the appropriate network tariff, and it would reduce the need of having more explicit form of demand side flexibility or also supply side flexibility. Meaning that if the demand would follow better, which is in the ideal case, then yeah, we will not be talking maybe about more explicit form or other mechanism to procure more flexibility. And we have done, we have done other scenario with 100% prosumer. Then, for instance, here we have lower flexibility level and also lower welfare gain, because there is not much that could be optimized in the last column here if we have enough assets or flexible assets and also well-designed network tariff. So the potential would be lower. Because here in the model, as I explained, the prosumer will react to the network tariff, and then there will be kind of a benchmark for the curtailment of passive consumer that would be curtailed to a level that would optimize the social welfare, but there will be a limit on that depending on the contribution of the prosumer first that would react to network tariff. I hope that I answered more or less.
Thank you very much, Athir.
Sylwia and then Christine.
Yes.
Sorry.
Sylwia, please. I think the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the presentation. Could you speak about to what value of lost load you're using in the different scenarios? I imagine that the value of lost load is very different if the curtailment is half an hour versus half a day, and if it's announced a day in advance, it has much different impact. So where do people take different values of value of lost load, and what are the values you've been using? Yeah, so I will go to the sensitivity slide, because here is the one where I use a different value. The value, they were based, or I took them from a Nouicer report of 2018. It's on different vol methodology calculation in Europe. And this was for the case of Belgium, that says in general, the vol is 9.6 euro per kilowatt hour.
However, they say in the case where the consumer are more aware, it will be kind of reduced by half. And it's also, they don't take into account, I think they only take it for 1 hour curtailment or loss of load. And in this case, yeah, I would assume if it's like 5 hours, then it can exponentially increase, or at least increase the value of lost load. But yeah, for this, we did not go further to assess the duration of the curtailment event, but also at the same time, we, in the different scenario, unless we have a very low vol, this won't go to a complete disconnection. It means, as you have seen in the consumer profile, they are reduced, but the consumption is not going to zero. It means that yeah, it's a reduction of the load. It's not a complete disconnection. We assess it in the paper different, like the case of 2 euro volt. Then at that case there is disconnection, and then we also did other sensitivity of including a cap on the maximum curtailment per hour. And for this, yeah, we also saw that there is lower potential for demand side flexibility, but in our reference scenario, we did not see the need of introducing this cap. And yeah, there are also now many studies that are on the methodology to calculate vol, and they say that, yeah, there should be a need for more segmentation of vol, and say between residential and industrial consumer, and also within residential consumer, the one that are richer, meaning that they could invest in smarter appliances and could be more independent from the network, they value electricity less. However, the one that are kind of energy poor, those are the one that maybe they still applies to them, the 10 euro volt for Belgium. But also across Europe, there is different variation of the value of lost load. And I think there is foreseen to soon to have a common methodology, at least for calculating, but not for the value themselves.
Thank you very much, Athir. I think, Christine, you have a question as well, please.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for the presentation, first of all. And then I'm wondering what is, or what according to you might be the virtue of combining these two instruments, the network charges, which already influence the network users to sort of pre-curtail themselves according to the prices they see, and then also implementing an explicit curtailment. I mean, initially, if both mechanisms were optimal, they could achieve the same, and now you combine them, maybe just for practical reasons, but maybe you also have some other thoughts why a combination of the two is something worth looking at.
The combination of the two, we decided on this because this is the business as usual case somehow, but we saw that, I mean, everyone has to pay network tariffs, but then if we want to use explicit form, we cannot not assess the impact of network tariffs. And we saw that in the state of the art, this is not really assessed. So, and we also saw different studies that list them as different tools, but they all say that, yeah, we have to see to which level they interact, whether they are complementary, whether they are not, because you could also say that maybe they're not complementary at all, and that's one of the thoughts that we had at the beginning. But then we saw, when we tried to see the different load profile with perfect and less perfect, with more perfect and less perfect, because there are, even when we have capacity-based network tariff, we cannot say that they are perfect because they are flat and they're not time differentiated. So yeah, there could be more perfect network tariff to be, but at the capacity-based one are somehow good, well-designed enough to be assessed. And we saw their contribution compared to volumetric tariff, and what would be added if we will add the more explicit form, because now the explicit form are the novelty that could be introduced, but the network tariff, yeah, they are all there, but they could also be redesigned, and many countries in Europe are working in this, in the framework of increasing penetration of prosumers.
Thank you very much, Athir. if no one has any other question, maybe I have just a short one related to the issue of tariff. Athir, what do you think about partial load shedding agreements? We see them more and more often in the literature. They are considered as a way to allow, to help reveal individual willingness to disconnect and to express by each one his own or her own priority for the use of electricity he or she will make. And it seemed to me that there was more or less a connection with your study. What do you think?
Yeah, in this study, we tried to investigate the theoretical, more or less, potential. We did not go into contractual term or into how this could be done. But one thing is that through contract, that they could be more market-based if, as you say, they are a way to reveal the willingness to receive money for this compensation. And here we want first for a administratively set compensation. We are thinking about, or we are planning to go for more, to assess the impact of market-based compensation in the next step of this work. And this also could be, if we go for a more detailed grid representation, then you could see maybe more strategic behavior depending on if the consumer would know that it's pretty much needed in that area, or it's much congested, that DSO absolutely needs some flexibility there. It may be game it or not. And in this case, it would be good to assess in which cases the flexibility could be more market-based, and in which other cases we should have like this fallback option of having an administratively set compensation. So yeah, we did not enter in contractual arrangement, but we will enter into market-based form, and that would reveal the willingness to be the amount of money the consumer would ask, depending also on his location of the grid, if you are going to model a grid, or depending on his own equipments, being battery, PV or not, if he's a passive consumer, whether he will require the vol value or less or more. That's something to be seen. And also maybe this is a way to see what is the value of lost load for prosumer, if that is what they will ask for in a market-based procurement.
Excuse me, Athir, we have to conclude to go to the next presentation. We're already running late. Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you very much, Athir. Thank you, Pierre, for reminding us to be quick. So then I will give the floor to Michiel Kenis, who will present us some regulatory incentives for transmission system operators on the flow-based market. Yes. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining this session and doing this presentation. I think if it's okay on the side, the floor is yours.
All right. I guess you can hear me clearly.
Yes, perfect. Perfect. Thank you.
All right, so my name is Michiel Kenis. Happy to present some research here. You might recognize that I have the same supervisor as Athir, because we're both from the University of Leuven. He's close to Brussels in Belgium. I'm going to talk about regulatory incentives, or TSOs, within the context of flow-based market coupling. Let me first give some context and also a bit of introduction on what is flow-based market coupling and what is incentive regulation, because these are two parts that I would like to merge in this paper or in this work. I'm going to end as well with some future research, because I consider this research as unfinished. So I'm definitely open for some feedback to guide my future work. Right, so market coupling obviously builds upon the concept of building or of connecting zonal markets, relying on some interconnections among zones, but also on internal transmission networks. And we all know that there exists nodal and zonal markets. both options consider physical constraint of the grid, but in different ways and to different degrees. And violations of grid constraints, many of which are not reflected in zonal prices, have to be resolved by remedial actions after market clearing. And we know that in Central Western Europe, since 2015, there's a methodology of flow-based market coupling in place, with intentions to expand it towards the rest of Europe, towards the core region. Although the date is quite uncertain, I'm not sure whether that's still accurate. But in general, the algorithm of flow-based market coupling aims to represent part of the grid during trades in the market. It monitors, therefore, the physical limits of some selected network elements and anticipates how changes in the market outcome affects the electrical flows on these elements. And thereby it claims to anticipate, or it anticipates better how trade affects flows. Now, in this left graph, you can see summarizing performance of market coupling price convergence in our region. The MACZT is a metric to indicate which fraction of transmission capacity is provided to the market. You can see that some are doing pretty poor, like for example, Belgium and Germany, they almost never exceed 70% threshold when providing capacity to the markets that the market can then implicitly trade in the energy market. Now, this lays in the fact that when defining this capacity that needs to be given to the market by the TSOs, this relies on some key predictive parameters to arrive there. And to arrive at this cross-border capacity, we know that ill-designed parameters can lead to, on the one hand, overly constrained domains, hindering price convergence, or on the other hand, oversized domains, which allow for greater trade volumes, but can entail more corrective congestion management. And both directions of error can lead to welfare losses. Now we know that there's quite some freedom left to TSOs to set the discretionary parameters and hence to calculate the capacities for trade. And given the rising share of renewable energies and power systems, it becomes more challenging to determine the transmission capacities for trade in a welfare optimal way. So although these parameters are subject to large uncertainties, research on methodologies to design them is not too expensive, I would say. And in the light of importance of flow-based market coupling on the outcome of Europe's electricity markets and the lack of, I would say, lack of transparency in the way that they are set, the goal of my work here is to identify some drivers behind possibly misaligned regulatory incentives for TSOs based on a mathematical model. And secondly, we provide options to design an incentive regulation scheme incentivizing the behavior of TSOs in a certain direction. Because as you know, in Europe, TSOs are regulated monopolies. And I'd like to represent flow-based market coupling and my model as well with these three stages. So you see 2 days ahead, 1 day ahead, and the day of delivery. The most important stage here maybe is the 2 days ahead, where the TSOs is setting the parameters and making predictions about the grid, and thereby deciding on what the transmission capacity will be that will be made available for trade in the day ahead market. So it provides some parameters to the market operator. Market clearing can happen, and as a consequence, some remedial actions might be necessary to resolve congestion. And each of these blocks represents an optimization problem, and I merge them, making it an equilibrium. Now, if we take a deeper look onto what this is, so how the TSOs arrive to those capacities for the market, there are some steps to go through. Please don't remember don't memorize the formulas, but just remember a TSO decides on the base case and generation shift keys and then arrives at some parameters among which the RAM, the remaining available margin. What does that mean? I think the base case is most important in my model. So for each hour of the day, 2 components are determined in the base case. which is an expectation of the electricity grid that the TSO has. On the one hand, it details expected flows on each transmission line that are going to be there, no matter how it came there, but it thinks it's going to be there. On the other hand, some expected net positions of each zone. Then there are some calculations done to arrive in the end at the RAM, the remaining available margin, which is the maximum capacity that can be implicitly auctioned in the day. And it is what is left from the thermal capacity when taking into account what the reference flow at zero net position would be. And these are then the estimated flows that the TSO thinks is going to be there, but that the day-ahead market does not see. So, for example, loop flows are captured by that. There are also some other margins like FRM and FAV that I don't consider. There are also some parameters here, the GSKs, at least if you're familiar with the flow-based market coupling. These are things that I don't consider because I set them correctly to my model. So they can't impact the outcome of the model. It's just the base case here that the TSO has some margin for interpretation on what he needs to set and how that then affects the RAM, in other words, the constraints that the TSO gives to the market. As some assumptions already mentioned, some more are that I consider all transmission lines as critical branches. In practice, TSO can choose which lines are critical and on which he needs to do some calculations. Also don't consider any security mechanisms like the N-1. The margins are set to 0, as I said, and I assume correct PTBS, as I also said. Now we can ask ourselves, okay, if the TSOs have some freedom in theory to set these parameters, for example, the base case that leads to a certain RAM, what are his incentives to put it there? And if you then go have a look in the regulations, you see two things. First of all, there are min-RAM criterions appearing, saying actually which percentage of the physical transmission capacities that are there should be provided to the market for trade. Currently in Europe, that's 20%. But is going to increase towards 70% by 2025. However, there are quite some derogations on those regulations going on. And a second incentive that there might be is, of course, the TSO is a regulated monopoly. So there is some budget control from the regulator coming, among others, stating limits on what the redispatch costs can be that the TSO incurs. Now, there are signs in reports from regulators saying that these two measures are not sufficient with regard to cross-border flow and to increase price convergence in Europe with the aim of one single interconnected transmission network. And therefore, in my model, I aim for, or I include incentive regulation, which also starts to emerge by some TSOs. For example, in the UK, incentive regulation is intensively used. So inspired by that, I set up a model that allows the TSO to receive some monetary incentives, which is an extra remuneration it gets, based on some building blocks, based on the evaluation of his performance. So in my model, I evaluate transmission capacity for trade that he makes available to the market, the congestion management costs that he incurs and also passes through in the tariff, then the head generation costs that customers face, and then the congestion rents that the TSO also faces. And now the challenge is, well, what are the drivers behind this and how could you push a TSO towards the welfare maximizing optimum with this incentive regulations? Now, in my model, we see now back the three blocks where I started with. The most important one is how I model the TSO. So he maximizes the incentive given all the calculations he needs to do on the parameters, given the min-RAM criterion, and given other constraints like the redispatch cost allowance. Now, what can such an incentive be? For example, it could be that incentive says you have to minimize expected redispatch costs. It could be minimize worst case redispatch costs. You could also add maximization of the RAMs that he gives to the market. There can be a lot of options there. And you might already notice, given that I say expected redispatch cost or worst case redispatch cost, that I also consider uncertainty. Specifically, I consider uncertainty 2 days ahead on what the generation patterns will be. So TSO is uncertain about what costs he will incur. And so he can look at the most expected cost, or he can look at a more risk-averse view towards the cost, looking at more worst case costs, for example, on redispatch. So this is how I model the TSO. Then here's a descriptive way of how I model the market clearing. And here it's nice to see that there's literally one line called the flow-based domain that entails the parameters that the TSO defines, and that literally limits the market clearing. So for example, here you see the RAMs that are putting a limit on something, and that something is the estimation of the market of flows. So this is how we can nicely see that the decision of a TSO on its base case, on its RAM, and later on what the markets can trade, have a direct impact on the market. So consequently, also some redispatch may have to occur given the market clearing, and that's for each possible scenario on generation. Now I like to apply these types of methodologies on very simple networks. So here I used a 3-zone 4-node network as an illustration. I add some generation capacity to each node, of which I make node 1 uncertain. So let's assume there's node 1 with renewable energies with some scenarios. So a different load factor and different scenarios and probabilities. Furthermore, I also consider all transmission lines to be unlimited, except for a line 4.1, on which I assume a limited capacity of 100 megawatts. So being the line of interest and being the congested line, as you can already guess. There is also some offtake located. Now, if we now give a set of base cases out of which a TSO could choose, given its expectation, but also given the feasibility of that base case, you can't just say random numbers that account for the flows on certain lines. They have to make sense. They have to follow the laws of Kirchhoff. So we give a discrete set of options for base cases to TSOs. I chose 15 cases, and that directly leads towards a certain RAM on the congested line. As you can see here, then there's a RAM in both directions. That's why it's 2-dimensional. So for example, here it ranges from 25 to a bit more than 100 of its capacity. So the implicit assumption I make here is that there is some space for TSOs to interpret what he thinks is going to happen and to interpret which base case he needs to set, which could have a big impact on outcomes of markets and redispatch. If we then look at the head generation costs and redispatch costs that the TSO expects, I've plotted them here for the 15 possible base cases, arranged with a lower RAM and also a more constraining grid representation. And the crosses indicate the average costs that the TSO expects 2 days ahead, together with the quantiles and decimals. And we can already see two things. So constraining grid representation, so more to the right, takes away some of the uncertainty that there is on generation. So there are some scenarios of generation at node 1, but by imposing a very constrained grid representation, some scenarios just aren't feasible to be cleared in the market, taking away the certainty on both the head generation costs and redispatch costs. Secondly, we also see, and that's maybe already known or shown by other papers as well, that higher RAMs, so choosing base cases more to the left, implying more price convergence, imply that there are less expected day-ahead generation costs and more expected redispatch costs. However, one often talks about the expected costs rather than considering the uncertainty that goes with it. So for example, you could see that if you have a more optimistic view on redispatch costs, you could say that, okay, the difference is not too big when varying the RAM, if you would have a more pessimistic view, so going to the upper bound, you see that the difference or the impact of choosing the base case is more impactful. So that already gives a sign that uncertainty, or taking into account uncertainty, might be valuable. Now, for the interest of time, I was planning on now looking at the marginal effects of each of the building blocks in the incentive regulation scheme. I'm going to skip that. I'm just going to arrive at what I think is the most important slide, which is when I combine in the incentive regulation that the TSO gets a stimulus to increase RAMs on the one hand, and a stimulus to decrease expected redispatch costs. So it gets a monetary remuneration depending on how it performs on that case. So for example, this is a case how it's organized in Belgium.
Excuse me, Michiel, you have 3 minutes left.
Yeah, perfect. Now on the graph here, you can see on the x-axis the RAMs that the TSO chooses by setting its base case, ranging from 25 to 100. And on the y-axis, I set out the incentive it gets after its performance. Now an MRAM is just something you can interpret as the magnitude of the stimulus to increase the RAM. Now, if we don't have that stimulus to increase the RAM and only to decrease redispatch cost, you see that it's obvious, following the blue line, that the TSO will set its RAM really low because he wants to maximize the incentive it gets. If you start to increase the stimulus to increase the RAMs, you are switching towards the green line, and you start to look at when you arrive at the green line, the TSO will choose a base case that arrives at a high RAM, because this endpoint is higher than this left point. So it will shift from the one extreme towards the other extreme, choosing a high base case. So what we basically see here is that both components of incentive regulations that are often stressed by regulators are countering each other actually. So there's a risk to incentivize only the extreme, so that you have an abrupt shift from left to right, while probably the most optimal case is somewhere in between. And that's what we see in my example as well, but I didn't show it here. So it's hard to incentivize the cost optimal situation or the welfare maximizing situation, which is somewhere in the middle, if you have those two components in place in your incentive. And thirdly, if you would be more risk averse at TSO, so anticipating on more pessimistic redispatch costs instead of the expected costs, there is even more incentive for TSOs to put their RAMs quite low, because the stimulus to decrease the effective redispatch cost, which might be pessimistic, gets higher, right? And that brings me to the conclusion. So given the equilibrium model I provided, we show in the related paper that an accurate design of the TSO parameters is essential to represent the grid in the market, which is in the end the goal. And that the interplay of all parameters pose a trade-off between, on the one hand, facilitating trade, so price convergence, and on the other hand, keeping congestion management costs at acceptable level, while the welfare optimum is somewhere in the middle, probably. And these parameter choices can be steered with incentive regulation schemes, and incentivizing both price convergence and low transmission tariffs, because that's in the end the goal of evaluating the expected redispatch costs in the incentive. That might lead to a suboptimal outcome. And that's maybe also part of future work, is that incentive regulation schemes should take into account the uncertainty on generation as well. Now, there are some points of future work I could dig into, but I think I'm looking forward to comments or questions that there might be. Thank you.
Then, thank you very much, Michiel, for this very interesting insight in the need for regulation when addressing the question of setting up the capacity model via flow-based methodology. Are there any questions from the audience or from the attendees?
Hi. I would have a question. That's all right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Hi. Thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting. And I was wondering, because I'm not so familiar with how flow-based market coupling is actually procured by the TSOs. And is it you said that the TSO decides on some aspects, right? So it decides on the base case or decides on the reference flow and therefore on the remaining available margins. But is this actually the case? So has the TSO actually the ability to say, well, if we nominate this specific line, can we, with a specific capacity, let's say 400, and then let's go run the algorithm, run the thing? Does it work like that, or because then all the benefit of flow-based market coupling would be down the drain if somebody sits in the headroom and decides random numbers, and everybody has to abide.
Yeah, I see your point. There are indeed guidelines well written out. I think the chair here of this session can confirm that there are quite strict guidelines on that. However, there is, at least from my perspective, still quite some room to motivate some choices and to steer some decisions. And the existence of the minimum criterion might be an indication for that. I don't say that the minimum criterion that is currently in place is a good thing, but that might be an indication for that. But indeed, as you say, I think flow-based market coupling is still a second best solution to organize markets. And given the fact that there is some TSO behavior in between that should be regulated, because I don't say TSOs are doing bad things, they are just regulated in a certain way and have to comply with some certain obligations that might be conflicting. I just say that there might be a possibility that this falls into a third best solution instead of a second best solution if the regulation is not properly defined. But indeed, there is this key element in which there is some freedom left to TSOs, and the extent to which that happens is indeed debatable. I think my goal here is to take it quite extreme and to look at the possibilities. But you raise a good point.
And the base case is I mean, it's somewhat defined as the best estimate of the system state, and then so this is load and renewable feed-in forecasts, right? So and then the residual has to be covered by I don't know, the power plant stack or something, right? So yeah. then the uncertain, so the decision would be then the reliability margins or something like that, right?
The reliability margins are also part of an independent decision, indeed. And the base case is just an expectation of the state of the grid as a result of all flows that are going to be there, be it through the day-ahead market or not. Yeah, because as you know, the market cannot capture all laws of Kirchhoff, and there has to be an estimation. But indeed, or choosing the base case right stays an estimation. So there is some room for setting it, just as the reliability margin, that's also an estimation. So that's one more indication that there might be an option to steer it a little bit to a certain direction.
Just a question, if I can jump to the question. I think I share the concern of Richard regarding the way you present RAM. So I have a simple question. As you presented in your presentation, RAM is a result of a computation. You subtract to the thermal limit what is actually direct consequence of the base case, the reference flow, and then what is effectively at hand at this stage, at the hand of the TSO, is the flow-based remaining margin. So my understanding is that the true levers which are at hand of the TSOs are the base case. But in your example, the base case is quite simple. And I like this simplistic view because it shows what base case is, and then the environment. In your case, and assuming absolutely no uncertainty, so contrary to Richard, I will go the other way around and consider a system without any uncertainty, in particular unrest. In that case, and if we assume the CEP option, we can start from a base case, which is with no exchange at all. And in that case, the only remaining assumption that the TSO has to make is to decide in zone, I think it was the zone A, is your 2 nodes, where to inject. And then the flow-based is a matter of linearization around that point. And therefore, my understanding was that those 2 elements where you actually decided to inject or to take the infin from in the zonal and the flow-based relative margin were where the question actually is. And I fully understand that there is an interest, for a public interest, to incentivize TSO regarding that aspect. But once they are determined, and if you assume, once again, full flexibility and full previsibility, there is just a balance between redispatch and capacity. If you provide too much capacity, you will have to pay redispatch. Once again, provided that full flexibility is ensured, you will not modify anything to the social welfare. You will just change. The social welfare is shared between direct consumers, direct market players, and the TSOs. And therefore, my understanding from your article is that you put the stress on the impact of uncertainty and previsibility 2 days ahead in the European context of the base case with respect to what will happen. And if I were you, I would prevent that, if you agree, more with that in mind, because I think it would be better understood from the TSOs. And I think it's definitely a topic which is worth being understood by TSOs, fully understood, and by regulators as well.
Excuse me, Jean-Yves and Michiel, we're already running late. Maybe we have time for a last question from Tim, and then we have to switch to the next presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Michiel. Excellent presentation, and we already discussed it before. One question that I had is when you had this graph where you show if you go for less RAM, that you have this trade-off between redispatch costs and day-ahead costs. Maybe you can go back to that briefly, and that the impact of uncertainty. No, it's one back, and the impact of uncertainty then. And what I wondered was, yeah, this one, where you somehow can end up with a situation with higher day-ahead generation costs under very low. I know this is lower RAM. Yeah, but there's still, it's very wide. You can end up in a situation, let's say, with better day-ahead costs with a lot lower RAM. How is that possible? Like if you would give more capacity to the day-ahead market, you would still end up with a more expensive system. Is that correct?
Yeah, you make a good point.
Because I would expect that the more you give, you would always end up with lower costs unless something.
Yeah, you make a good point. It looks like I mixed up the axis then. Because if you have a lower RAM, you indeed have a more constrained market, and you would expect, you would expect the highest generation cost. Yeah, so there I don't see the problem there. So if you have a lower RAM, you have a very constrained market, so not like the markets won't be as welfare maximizing, and it could have been in case of non-restriction. So the expected cost could be higher.
Yes, could be higher, but due to uncertainty, it could also be lower, or maybe I'm misinterpreting it.
Due to uncertainty, there is some margin indeed, but there's no indication that it can be lower as well. I don't really see.
I think what you show is on average it's higher. You say that on average it's higher if you're more constrained, but within the uncertainty, it could be that it's also lower, and that it could be that it's also lower. It's a bit surprising for me.
Excuse me, Michiel, one last sentence maybe about your work, and then we have to switch. Sorry.
Yeah, I think with lower RUMs, you a priori exclude some scenarios to be feasible and to be cleared in the market. And I think that's why there are still some options that some scenarios might be feasible and some not, which might vary in the end expected costs, and in some scenarios as well.
Okay, thanks.
Points.
Thank you very much, Michiel. So now I think it's time to give the floor to Christine Brandstaett. I hope I'm pronouncing your name the right way. So we will speak about market versus regulated pricing for access to distribution. I think it will be very interesting. So if it's okay on your side, the floor is yours. I'm not sure your mic is turned on because I can't hear you personally.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Once I share the screen, apparently I can't go back to. And you can also see the slides. Yes. All right. Well, and thank you very much for the introduction. And I'll be talking, as you said, about markets versus listed pricing for access to distribution network. What I'm presenting is joint work together with Rahmat Poudineh from the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. So at least part of, if not all, the achievements go to him as well. I'll give you a quick outline of what you should expect. I'll be first motivating why this is a topic worth thinking about. I want to introduce the concept of restricted access, or rather my definition of it that we're using for the paper. And then I want to compare listed pricing to market-based allocation of universal access as it is standard and of restricted access. We come to the conclusion that it can be equivalent under certain circumstances, and then obviously we need to talk about the conditions under which that holds true. We find that depends, or that those conditions can be fostered by design options for the market, and we're going to discuss those as well. And then in the end, I'll be transferring that to some examples in practice, or well, not actual practice examples, but ones that we could imagine could occur in practice, and then conclude from there. I'll try and be quick so we can manage with the time that remains. Now, why did we choose to look into this topic? Historically, the access to distribution networks has been assigned as universal access as we see it, in the sense that a user can choose to use his full fuse capacity at any time, and what they pay is a listed price that is previously decided by the network operator. And then the network operator supplies whatever capacity results from the choices of the users and tries to sort of keep the costs down. That's initially or historically what used to happen, and already now we're seeing some departures from these concepts, particularly in two ways. One, where the access is still assigned based on listed prices, but the access that is assigned may have some restrictions, in the sense that, for example, you may know that you will incur some curtailment, or that there is risk that you will incur some curtailment, or you could see different prices for different time periods, things like that. The price is still known and set ahead of time, but there may be, for example, a rebate, so the price could be a bit less for this restricted access. That's one concept that we're seeing. And the other one would be that you still have universal access initially, but you can decide to give some back to the network operator. In another way, say the network operator buys some access back, and then also that restricts the access that the user has, but the price sort of forms in a more market-based way. And then it may be worth thinking about in the future if we're already seeing those two dimensions of more market-based prices and of also restricted access, why not think about assigning restricted access in a market-based way initially already, or maybe at least think of using those two complex concepts in complement of each other. So that's what we're looking at with this paper. Now, what do I mean when I talk about restricted access? We're considering restricted access as opposed to universal access. Universal access meaning a user is free to choose within the access rights that were initially assigned when and how and to what extent to use them. And as opposed to that, we consider that it could be restricted, this type of access, in various dimensions that are shown here. For example, in the dimension of time, we could differentiate between peak and off-peak access, access during the day and the nighttime, you name it. There could also be different prices or different access rights for a direction of access, injection versus withdrawal. Obviously, there could be different access rights in different locations, which can be relevant for mobile users, such as electric vehicles, but it could also move into the dimension of depth, where a initially stable or static user has access to, say, only the local grid or to some regional, but not the entire grid. So those are possible restrictions that you could think of. And then lastly, also, well, maybe not lastly, because this is probably not exhaustive, but lastly, in the dimensions we're looking at, you also need to consider restrictions concerning firmness. And the dimensions that I put on the slide here are seen from the perspective of the network operator. So from the network operator's perspective, random access would be access where the user decides freely when and how to use the access rights that they have, and therefore from the network's operator's perspective, that's random. They don't know when and how they're going to use it. And it could also be firm in the sense that they have to commit to a certain access, or it could be controllable where the network operator has the right to influence what type of use the user makes of the network. So this is the concept of restricted versus universal access. And now we're going to look at how to allocate them. We're first giving an example of universal access where we just came up with a simple demand vector of demands divided in off-peak and peak periods, and assign different utilities to those different periods for a set of users. And then if we want to assign universal access, where essentially it doesn't matter if you want to access in peak or off-peak period, basically the utility for universal is a combination of the utilities you derive in both periods. And that would, in this example, decrease for the second unit of universal access because the users that we put here don't actually require off-peak access, 2 units of off-peak access. So for the second unit of universal access, they only derive utility during the peak period. Now, if you assign this kind of access in a universal way via listed prices, any combined pair of access that has a utility higher than 3, which is the capacity cost, will be bought essentially. So the network operator sets the price at 3, and then the users decide to buy it if their willingness to pay is higher. As opposed to that, in an auction, you basically have a very similar mechanism, but the users bid their utility, sort of provided to the network operator, and the network operator decides that anybody who has a willingness to pay higher than 3 will be assigned the access. It's a slightly different process, but in this setting, it results in the same allocation, and therefore will be considered equivalent, so to say. And therefore also the allocation you see there marked in the table is the same for these two forms of allocation. Now, what changes if we look at restricted access is that suddenly, not very surprisingly, these two different dimensions of utility, peak and off-peak, start to play a role. We disaggregate the utility that we combined beforehand. And if we use listed prices, the network operator would normally set prices such that in the peak period, they try to recover all the capacity costs, whereas in the off-peak period, they only need to recover a variable cost, and we implicitly assume that is 0. So we have prices of 3 and 0 for the two periods, and users peak access if their willingness to pay is higher than 3, and they would buy off-peak access if it's higher than 1, if it's positive. And then you can see in the table how that results in every user buying an off-peak access and only 2 of them buying peak access. And again, if we use an auction mechanism, which I guess I will not be explaining in detail for reasons of time management here, that results in the same type of allocation. However, if we move to a comparison between the two, you can see that the allocation is different, if not between the two allocation mechanisms, but between the two access schemes. And that is because in the differentiated access case, the user 1 does not receive its peak access unit, simply because the utility he or she receives from that access does not exceed the cost to the system of providing it. So the differentiated access case can be deemed more efficient than the universal one. And the conclusion from that can be that it is, at least under certain circumstances, beneficial to differentiate access. And that's probably why it's done in reality, or why we're seeing first signs of that. However, we still remain with the question how to assign it. And we identify certain conditions under which this equality holds, in the sense that listed prices and market-based allocation are the same. And I will just briefly go over them. Actually, I'm good with time. I can take some time. The first condition would be that the network operator has incentives to build optimal capacity. I mean, it is in a way a no-brainer because that's implemented in the system already, but if we're thinking about markets and taking away the regulated prices, we can't, or at least our conclusion is that we can't take away that part. We still need to have some monopoly regulation, if not, even if we can drop regulation of the actual prices, if it is in place right now. So that is required even if you move to market-based pricing. The second precondition is knowledge of the long-term marginal cost, and that's not so easy in practice either, because it can be quite difficult to precisely distinguish between cost for, say, different parts of the network or different types of users. So actually assigning or knowing the cost, I mean, in my example, it's just 3, it's there, and we can set a price accordingly. But in practice, it can be rather difficult. However, it's difficult for listed prices if you want to differentiate access options, as well as for markets. So that's also not what makes a difference between the two. What actually makes a difference is the knowledge of users' utilities. So if you want to implement listed pricing, essentially to do it efficiently, you need to know, or at least have a good estimate of the elasticity or the utility that a user, the elasticity of demand or the utility that a user derives from having access to the network. And maybe normally that would be projected from the past, or there could be some calculations how an electric vehicle would behave. But there's still some uncertainty, obviously, to this knowledge, to this information. And with a market-based allocation, the virtue, at least in theory, is that users will reveal this information to the market. Alas, coming with the drawback that that revelation is always prone to strategic behavior and maybe market power. So because those aren't, say, or they can be physical conditions, like in the market, in a network, in part of the network, you could have a constellation of users which are just prone to market power, but it's also influenced by the market design and by design options. And therefore, we also look at design options that could create or enhance benign circumstances for an efficient allocation. And that's what I'll be looking at next. So 3 central design options that we look at and that we discuss are repetitions, bid transparency, and pricing rules. For repetitions, as in how often is an auction or a market repeated, and how long resulting from that is the access period, how close to the actual time of delivery do you purchase your access rights. We come to the conclusion that short could be superior to long-term allocation, essentially because it provides chances for new entrants. With long-term allocation, basically the cake is already distributed, whereas if there's recurring auctions, the chances that you might get access to the type of capacity you need increase. There's also a higher predictability for demand if it's procured short-term rather than long-term, and especially if you think about a user procuring access or a network operator selling access to a line for, say, the entire lifetime of an asset, which can be 30 or 40 years, the likelihood that whichever user procured this capacity would default during the time when they're still paying for their access also maybe is not negligible. So by reselling the access in shorter periods, you also decrease that risk. However, the big drawback is that there's, with recurring auctions, there is a big opportunity to learn, maybe also signal to other users what are your preferences, and therefore you sort of build the stage for implicit or even implicit collusion. And you also give users the chance to retaliate if somebody does not adhere to any collusive agreements. There's less certainty for the network operator if you assign access short term, and if you consider transaction cost, obviously they increase if the auction is held more often. Another aspect that's relevant is bid transparency. We conclude in favor of sealed or at least anonymous bids in order to counteract the learning and signaling that we've been talking about for the repeated auctions, and also in order to encourage the involvement of weaker bidders who may benefit if their willingness to pay is not obvious to other bidders. However, if there's an uncertainty about the common value of any type of capacity, if you can't see the bids of others, this uncertainty is obviously enlarged. With anonymous bids, however, that might not be such a problem. And then maybe most importantly, we find that a uniform pricing rule could be beneficial simply because we think that encouraging truthful bidding is very central to this. As I said, maybe the biggest value that a market-based allocation can bring is to reveal the actual utility retrieved from network access, and therefore it's very critical that users bid truthfully, and that is typically encouraged by uniform bidding. I will not go through all of these arguments and just move quickly to the next part, which is resale. So the arguments that I discussed up until now hold for any type of market-based allocation. However, even if the allocation initially wasn't necessarily market-based, say via listed prices as it is done now, or a grandfathering approach where you just get the same capacity that you always needed, there can still be a market-based element if resale is allowed, in the sense that it reselling access rights or parts of access rights corrects and initially, even if the initial allocation was efficiently, corrects this initial allocation. It reduces the risks both for buyers that come with long-term products, and it can help the network operator to develop capacity efficiently, because if you recurringly see the value that your access rights have on the market, you can maybe better decide where to build new capacity, where to put grid enhancing technology, and so on and so forth. However, a large drawback of this might be that if you allow resale, you basically legitimize transfers between colluding competitors. And so far as collusion is a problem here, obviously it's enhanced by this. Also, especially if you think of grandfathering or inefficient listed prices, it shifts surplus from formally or with an optimal allocation, the regulated operator, to private parties who used to hold those rights inefficiently and now even can make profits from them. And then
We have 2 minutes left, Christina.
Yeah, that'll be okay, I guess. A last design option is encouraging this resale. I mean, one thing is to allow it, and another one to encourage or even force it. That is often done in market-based allocation in order to prevent predatory behavior, prevent users, say incumbents, from hoarding capacity in order to prevent others from accessing downstream markets. If that's something that's feared in the market for network capacity, then encouraging resale is an option to deal with that. And as you can see here, there's no, well, at least no obvious or very important drawbacks to this option. It basically helps to involve new bidders and increase competition by involving these new bidders. So if we then transfer this to 2 examples, for example, a wind generator which locates in a export constrained area, which could be then a new competitor to the already existing wind generators in that same area. It's easy to see from what we just discussed how differentiated access benefits in such a scenario, because the new generators can share the already existing capacity, and the allocation can be adapted to this new situation where maybe a new competitor values the access more than the others. However, there we have this problem that the incumbents may have an incentive to deter the entry of the new generator. However, if we consider a framework with a congestion-blind electricity market, the actual gain from deterring one competitor in one region, whereas the market is global or national at least, may not be so big, and therefore potentially in that setup, the problem isn't as big as you would initially think. And also, if we consider new technologies, for example, that network operators can adapt capacity with grid enhancing technology, also capacity hoarding doesn't really work. The same if there is an option to force curtailment, it doesn't work because it'll essentially just affect your own access to capacity. Another problem there is monopsony power for the generators towards the network operator. We also obviously don't want that because it's going to result into low prices for the network capacity. And as we already discussed, this could maybe be addressed by short access periods and also by potential for intermediaries who can even anticipate future competition and introduce that into the equation. The mirror example then is new consumers, for example, electric vehicles in an import constrained region. Also there, it's easy to see how there would be benefits from differentiated access. The challenges that we have with allocating that in a market-based ways are a bit different here. And some of that has been discussed in the previous presentations already. So the first challenge we put here is that those new users, especially if it's small users with electric vehicles, they may not know or have a good idea of the value of their flexibility because they're inexperienced with that. And therefore, even though in theory the market is a good instrument for them, yeah, maybe they can't use it right, at least initially. And then to buffer that, potentially aggregators can play a useful role. However, if then with an aggregator, you sort of institutionalize the demand side, you may reintroduce this problem of monopsony power into the equation. And there we assume, or we consider that maybe it's likely, it's easily to detect it if an aggregator uses or exercises market power when users such as households or electric vehicles are very uniform, and it's easy to see that they deviate from other types of similar users, which there are many of them in the grid. So those are some of the implications in practice, and that leads me to a quick conclusion. I hope that I was able to show that on the one hand, in constantly evolving distribution grids with increasingly flexible users, there is value in restricting network access rather than having universal access. And there could be value in allocating this access in a market-based way rather than with the listed prices that we see so far. However, there are some preconditions, and that would be adequate design of the products and market rules. We discussed some of this. And then we also want to give an outlook to some other concerns that there are, because we just focus on the efficient allocation and economic efficiency. And there may easily be some social or political concerns with market-based allocation as well, such as that users may not be entirely rational and unexperienced, and therefore you wouldn't want to rely on them when it comes to security of supply and using flexibility rather than building technology or building assets. Yep, that's it. Quick overview of the paper. I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to get some comments, answer some questions.
We have 6 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Christine. Would any of the attendees have a question to start the discussion with Christine? Then if it's not the case, maybe I can start. First of all, I would like to know, as an element of context, whether you were aware of already running experiments in Europe or outside Europe of where operators decided to go for auctions in terms of grid access.
Yes, thank you. I mean, basically, some of those experiments were the inspiration to even start the analysis, in the sense that some of the auctions that network operators put up in Europe, for example, are, or we consider that they are an instance of buying back capacity from network users. So that's essentially the departing point from the analysis. And that happens in sometimes more, sometimes less market-based ways. So they can be considered a first representation of the concept. However, for like entirely market-based allocation or resale options, to the extent that we discussed them here, that is something that will be inspired by those first examples. And then potentially, if they go well and if people are happy with how they work, they would be developed, or markets like that would be developed in the future.
Thank you very much. Any question from the audience? No, then maybe I can add another question. You mentioned in your abstract that the solution you propose, the market solution you propose, could be extended to the transition grid. And therefore, I would have one question in two, in fact. First of all, it reminds me, maybe I'm wrong, of the FTR solution used in the US, where you buy access to the transition grid, and the way the auction is set up allows for the inclusion of this matched behavior, which is inherent in the transition system. And the second part of my question relates to the European context. In Europe today, we have two sets of grid operators, TSOs and DSOs, and flexibility, which is very important for the future of our system. Largely depends on the way access to the grid is performed. And therefore, I assume that there should be a collaboration when setting up these auctions, when designing the markets between TSOs and DSOs. What is your opinion about this?
Yeah, that's really a good addition or putting into perspective of the ideas of the paper. I mean, we're very much on a conceptual basis or level with what we look at. So distinction between transmission and distribution don't even play that much of a role. I mean, the examples we're looking at are inspired by distribution, but then if you consider this restriction or this dimension of restriction of depth, where you have access to, say, a local part of the grid and then a part of the grid deeper down, that is essentially, if you think it further and further, will lead you to the distribution grid. So it's then just another or an extreme part of this dimension of depth. And therefore, the financial transmission rights that you mentioned obviously have been an inspiration, or at least something to look at in order to research these questions. However, my impression was that there are not, or maybe not yet, differentiated in the way or to the extent that we consider. In some dimensions, yes, maybe, but in other dimensions, they are less differentiated. And maybe for good reasons, because it can be quite difficult, as I said, to really calculate and allocate rights that are differentiated to past a certain extent. So that would be a challenge then between DSOs and TSO, but even if it were, say, one integrated network operator to differentiate rights to that extent, where you distinguish different degrees of depth and also different degrees of time and location, would likely be rather challenging. And you would have to balance that between the complexity it entails, whether there's still some benefit to that. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we have to go to the last presentation, and we have exactly 30 minutes, no more, before I have to end the session.
And then I welcome Sylwia Bialek from the Institute of Policy Integrity on the topic of information. Who knows what? Information barriers to efficient DER rollout. Thank you very much, Sylwia.
Thank you so much. So I hope now you are all warmed up and ready to take in the last talk. So be ready for the ride. Yes, in this presentation, we are going to take a bit of a bird's eye perspective. In the paper, namely, my colleagues from NYU and we are thinking about information issues around distributed energy resources. So their importance, consequences, and solutions. And what I will mean by information issues generally is basically the inavailability of some information that is relevant for decision makers when making the decisions. So you probably know very well what distributed energy resources are, but just as a reminder, so those are the resources that connect to distribution grids as opposed to connecting to transmission grids as traditional power plants do. And those could be any type of technology. So there are DERs that are solar panels, EVs, small gas facilities, batteries, demand response, etc. And those resources are growing. It is expected that they will go up in the US up to almost 400 gigawatts. And for reference, currently there's around 1,300 gigawatts of capacity in the US in total. So we expect them to grow, and they bring a lot of changes to the electricity sector. So they change how utilities operate, what demand utilities face, they change emissions, system resilience, but they also influence the technical side of running the distribution grids, because the distribution grids were not designed for injections from within the grid. And so because of the size of DERs and because of their importance for how the future grid looks like, there has been a flurry of research, especially looking at future policies and regulations needed for distributed energy resources. And this literature is relatively new, but it has already generated many great insights. And when you look at those papers, you will notice that usually their modeling is pretty complex, especially when papers try to think about the welfare effects of various policies. And the reason for this complexity is because there are many institutions, but also many agents that are affected by DERs. So you have consumers who make the decisions about investment into DERs. You have utilities whose sales change and business models change. The transmission level resources are affected through the generation from the households. Then you have aggregators. The wholesale markets are affected, and of course the regulator kind of comes in and tries to fix potential problems. The additional complexity is that the utility makes investment into the distribution network, and the distribution network is affected by DERs, but at the same time, the state of a distribution network decides how much DERs can come online. And so it ends up being a very complex model, usually thinking about policies for DERs. And so maybe it's not surprising that given this complexity, most of the papers have been focused, with few notable exceptions, of course, most papers have been focused on thinking about first best solutions and assuming away various imperfections. And what it means in particular is that most papers assume complete and perfect information, meaning everyone has full knowledge about all other market participants, information is available about profit functions, risks, infrastructure, and the past moves are also known. We know that this assumption might not be without loss of generality, as information matters. If you have information problems, first of all, for theorem might not hold, markets might not be efficient, regulatory interventions might be needed. What it also implies is that if there are information problems, then the conclusions from the first best studies about outcomes and policies might actually not be correct. So when we go back to the traditional literature on transmission level assets, from this literature, we know that information issues do arise in the electricity sector. So I'm sure you're familiar with the contributions from the 80s about utility price regulation, how difficult it is because of the information advantage that the utility has. And I list here a few other subjects that have emerged over the recent decades in connection to the traditional resources. So one could ask, if we know that in the context of transmission level units, we have so many information issues, why don't we see many publications in the context of DER that look at the importance of information? And it could be that there's something inherent about the distributed resources that makes the information problems less relevant. But maybe it is just that literature is relatively new, and so the research has not had time to think about importance of information yet. So in this paper, our goal is to investigate to what extent the information problems might be relevant in the DER context. And going forward, should we expect the information issues to persist or maybe to decrease? We want to identify the main areas where information issues might be relevant. So what exactly information is missing for the decision makers? Is it available elsewhere? We want to understand what are the consequences and think about solutions. And to do that, we are following three paths, I guess. So we dive into engineering and economic literature that summarizes distributed energy resources research. We also go to the regulatory proceedings. So those are proceedings run by decision makers or by policymakers in various states in the US, and we check whether in the documents that stakeholders submit, whether they flag out some information issues. And so the literature review and the regulatory proceedings, they help us identify where currently there are information issues, but they don't really tell us about their importance. So we don't know either how relevant those problems are in absolute terms, but also in relative terms. So what we did, we designed a survey for stakeholders in the US, explicitly asking them about the perception of information problems and about the relative magnitude of them. yeah, so as for the results, of course, it's not very surprising that we find that DERs actually are connected to substantial information problems, and that those information problems are heterogeneous across the stakeholders. So in the paper, we have a big discussion where we talk through the most important areas that we identify are missing information. And though those pertain to consumer information, there's the interconnection information that is missing. Information related to value of non-wire alternatives also emerges as a huge problem. And the DER remuneration, because of missing information, often proves difficult. So in this talk, and yes, so here in the slide, I listed kind of which stakeholders are most affected by those. Yes, stakeholders mentioned that the absence of information changes the pace of the decision-making for them, increases the risk, but what happens most frequently is that the set of projects that is feasible is limited, or set of policies that can be considered is limited. And so here I would like to focus on one area of this missing information, given the time we have available. So I would like to talk with you about the distribution network. And so what I mean here is the information on feeders, on hosting capacities, voltage constraint, impedances, etc. So this is type of information that historically has been hosted by utilities who were solely responsible for maintaining distribution networks. And for the longest time, no one else was really interested in this information. Only recently, as distributed resources have been built up, there has been increased demand for distribution network information. And the graph I brought you here shows on the x-axis what share of organizations that we spoke about declared distribution network information as important information. And you will notice that for distributed energy resource type of organizations, for regulators and environmental regulations, the distribution network is super important, less so for the consumers. So this is this axis. And then on the y-axis, we plot what share of organizations claim that the distribution network information is not sufficiently available. And what is striking is that DER developers and environmental organizations seem to have important problem with distribution network information. And why is this so? You need to know a lot about distribution network characteristics to determine whether you can connect a new resource to the grid. So this is, if you are a residential customer, this is very easy, and there are simplified procedures for you. But if you are commercial or industrial, you will have to know if the grid can take your resource, if it's kind of designed for it. And if it's not, the characteristics of the grid will tell you how expensive it will be to upgrade the grid. Because you can always interconnect, it's just going to be costly. So you, as a DER developer, you usually are missing this information. And additionally, some remuneration schemes for distributed resources are also based on what value those resources can bring to the local grid. And here again, as an investor, you will be unable to foresee what value you bring if you don't have the network information. And so, yes, the distributed resource aggregators, developers, investors, etc., all flag out the distribution network information as important but unavailable one. Interestingly, the regulators also desire this information, but we see that their problem with accessibility of it is much lower. And why this is so, of course, the regulators can just ask for more information. And you could think, if the regulator can ask for more information from the regulated resources, why can't they just ask and tell everyone else? So there are limits to what regulators can share with the public, especially if the information is commercially sensitive, and oftentimes the distribution network information is classified as such, or as a security sensitive information. Regulators won't be able to share this information. And so what happens if the distribution network properties are not widely known? As I mentioned, first of all, it's very hard for DER developers to know where to invest, where are the investment opportunities. But also the big issue that you might have heard about is the non-wire alternatives. So oftentimes, instead of having investment in distribution networks, it would make more sense for distributed resources to pop up. However, if you don't know what are the costs of the and properties of distribution network, it's very hard to judge where non-wire alternatives would be helpful and what value do they bring. So because of this lacking information, the non-wire alternatives have been held back. And also for policymakers, it's hard to design the proper remuneration policies if they don't fully understand the value of information. We were interested in seeing how important the information is. So we asked various stakeholders for quantifying the impact on their profits and we also asked them how supportive they would be of new regulation that imposes information requirements. And unsurprisingly, we find that distributed energy resources both claim they are affected the most, they are strongly affected by information access issues, and they support new regulations for information. And yes, utilities generally are the ones in this setup that are best informed. So skipping everything else, let's think about policy implications. So first of all, I think it's important that we as researchers think only not about first best settings, but also about imperfections, and availability of information could be one of those imperfections. If the information is not available, the rollout it will not be cost effective generally, and we probably will see too low levels of DER investments. If utilities have much more information than the rest of the market, then maybe also it is that utility of the ownership of DERs will be the efficient solution despite its potential for anti-competitive effects. So unless the regulators can make the information more available, it might make sense to allow utilities to own DERs. And regulators are trying to tackle the problem of information, and so far they have been just issuing mandates for releasing information. But the problem of this is they haven't changed the incentives for the regulated units for sharing information. And I think what it leads to is, of course, that the released information is low quality, as little of it is released as possible, et cetera, et cetera. But it would seem that it could be the more efficient approach to that would be to give incentives to agents to truthfully reveal the information they hold. And this is especially true in the context of utilities who have consumer information and distribution network information that is generally not available for others, but very, very valuable. And it's not that utilities are the bad guys who just don't want to share. It's more the way that the incentive system is set up for them is that sharing this information just hurts their profits. And yeah, so thank you for listening to this shortened version. And I would be very curious about your questions, but also we are basically almost cataloging cases of information problems. And I always get surprised by how weird information problems there are out there. And so I would also be very curious to hear if you came across something that you think has not gained enough attention. Please feel free to shoot me an email if you have examples of that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sylwia, for the very interesting talk. Pierre, how many questions do we have time for?
Well, if we can try to finish before 7:10, because Sylwia started later, so it's better if everyone has the same time for Q&A, but no more, please.
No. If would any attendee have a question, please feel free to raise your hand. But then, if it's not the case, I will start. I will have a question about the experience that you have here in the French example. So sorry, it's very French located, but I assume that we will be able to discuss it anyway. We were faced with similar issues, but at the same time, there is a strong difference in terms of market scheme between the US and Europe. And in Europe, the unbundling is quite strict. The DSO has been set up with no ability to invest in DR, for instance. So, neutrality has to be ensured, and DSO is only there to ensure that electricity is distributed among the grid. But of course, it's not only a matter of DSO, but also TSO. Though the National Regulation Authority decided to set up forced collaboration between the TSO and the DSO in a way to design a kind of proxy of the available capacity at a given connection node. The idea was to envisage what the capacity could be based on the potential DER in the region, then compute the cost, which would be incurred if such capacity was made available, of course, to try kind of balance between extra cost and available capacity, and then to compute a share per megawatt for connection to each newcomer, and a queue that was maintained up to the envisaged quantity. To me, it seems to be quite interesting because it reveals in a way, although it's not fully market-based for sure, the capacity available, but then it places all the future players at the same level of knowledge. What do you think about that? What would be your reaction?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very complex example, and I didn't know it before. So I'm not sure if I have very strong thoughts on this quickly. I think in general, unbundling helps with a lot of issues, but for example, at least when I'm thinking through non-wire alternatives, it seems nevertheless that operate as long as we remunerate operators of the grid for their capital investments, and we let them recover costs based on that, they will still have incentives for kind of maximizing the amount of needed investment as opposed to using alternatives. The mechanism you mentioned seemed like a plausible truth revealing mechanism. I think I will come back to you asking you for more details. And yes, so US is completely different, and I agree with this. What we've seen in US discussions are about performance-based remuneration schemes for utilities, kind of giving them certain amount of money for having a given share of DERs on the grid, which is of course imperfect in that it doesn't ensure that the DERs are built there where they create the most value or where they avoid most of the investments. And so it's a measure, but a very imperfect one.
Thank you very much. Of course, feel free to get in touch with me for further details. I'm pretty aware that it's not fully clear. It's a bit complex. Any other questions from the audience? Then
I think everyone is waiting for you to call the end of the conference.
I think so. So first of all, I would like to thank all the speakers for this very interesting session, and all the attendees for their question, everyone for the nice discussion. I also would like to thank especially the conference team, and in particular Pierre, for being the string timekeeper, much more stricter than I was. And
excuse me.
Thank you very much for you.
No, thank you. It was all very interesting. So I didn't want to interrupt or cut interesting discussions, but I tried my best.
That was perfect. So I really hope you enjoyed this conference I did, and not only this session, but the full 3 days. And I hope to see you in another context, and do not hesitate to exchange by email if you have something to share with me. So thank you very much once again, and enjoy the rest of your day, depending on where you are. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Please don't forget to upload your presentations on the dashboard, and it will be perfect. Thank you very much.